Most people feel heartbreak and outrage when they see yet another horrific school shooting on the news. Our next guest decided to do something about it. Please welcome the founder and leader of Moms Demand Action, Shannon Watts, to the stage. Thank you so much for being here. Shannon, what prompted you to finally do something? Because you're not a survivor of this,
right?
But you're a mom.
Yep.
And you're like, I'm sick and tired of seeing this week after week in America, where in 2023, the leading cause of death of children is now gun violence. And so what made you, a mom, say, you know what, enough's enough?
You know, I was a mom of 5, I still am, in Indianapolis. My kids were much younger then. This was the end of 2012 in December. And I watched this horrific tragedy unfold, you know, that 20 children and 6 educators could be slaughtered in a school, right, in Newtown, Connecticut. And I went to bed devastated, like most Americans, but I woke up so angry. And I wanted to join something like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, but for gun safety, but I couldn't find anything online after searching for hours.
So you Googled it?
Googled it, searched it, and I found a bunch of think tanks, mostly run by men. I found some one-off city and state organizations, also mostly run by men. And I knew I wanted to be part of a badass army of women. That's who I've seen do so much over and over again in this country, right? All the way from Prohibition up to the water crisis in Flint, Michigan.
Even before Prohibition.
Exactly.
Throughout history.
But that was sort of when women were allowed to be activists, right? And because men thought temperance was a Christian value, but they could never put that genie back in the bottle. And so I thought, okay, I'll start a Facebook page to have a discussion about the need for something like MAD, but for gun safety. Not realizing that type A women and moms across the country also had the same idea that day, and they just took my Facebook page and they ran with it. And they have turned it into the largest offline grassroots movement in the nation. Now we have 10 million supporters and we're twice as large as the NRA.
And you know, first of all, congratulations on that. But then another part of me, when I'm hearing that, is we shouldn't have that. We shouldn't have this organization. You know, this organization shouldn't exist in the world's most powerful and wealthy country, where guns are now the leading cause of death of our children. And having spent so much time on this, having invested, volunteered, you know, we were just talking right before. And I thought you actually got paid for this. And you said, nope, I'm volunteering. A question I have for you is, why does this country that you and I both love guns more than children?
It's a stark and important question. You mentioned that we are a powerful and wealthy nation. We also have something no other peer country has, which is a very powerful and wealthy special interest, which is the gun lobby.
NRA.
The NRA.
Let's name it.
But it isn't just the NRA anymore, unfortunately, right? There are actually organizations that are to the right now of the NRA and pulling that organization
to the right of the NRA.
Yes,
okay.
To the right of the NRA. Almost like the Tea Party pulled Republicans to the right in the 90s.
Which led to MAGA.
Right. These groups are pulling the NRA, which is leading to gun extremism gone amok.
What are these groups?
Well, every single state has its own version of the NRA. So, for example, if you live in Colorado, that group is called the Rocky Mountain Gun Owners. And they believe any attempt to regulate guns is an infringement on the Second Amendment. They support no gun laws whatsoever. So the NRA in '99 said they opposed guns in schools, they supported background checks. They have completely abandoned what was at the time still out of step with the mainstream. But now there's really no one in this country who sides with gun extremists except some extremists that we have elected to Congress and to state legislatures.
But Shannon, those some extremists represent one of the 2 major political parties. And the reality is, as you know, because you spend a lot of time in Virginia and DC, where I'm from right now, is that when you talk to many of these Republicans on the DL, they'll openly tell you, if I say anything, anything about gun control, it's over. My career is finished. And so how do we get any movement when one of the 2 political parties is, I'm going to use the word hijacked by what you're saying is now even a more extreme movement than the NRA?
I would say 10 years ago, what you're saying was the case. So when I started doing this work in 2012, about a quarter of all Democrats in Congress had an A rating from the NRA. Today, none do, not one. In fact, they proudly wear F-rated buttons. That's a seismic shift in American politics. Plus, this last summer, we passed the first ever federal gun safety legislation in a generation, 26 years.
Bipartisan.
Bipartisan, with 15 Republicans signing on, right? And back when there was a bill called Manchin-Toomey that failed just after the Sandy Hook school shooting, if you remember that, it would have closed the background check loophole in honor of that tragedy. And a handful of senators voted against that bill, including some Democrats. And I remember Senator Heidi Heitkamp said she was going to vote against the legislation, a Democrat from North Dakota, because she was hearing from her constituents 7-1 against the bill.
Yeah.
We said that'll never happen again. Lawmakers can vote against this legislation that the vast majority of Americans support, but they need to be honest about why.
Yeah.
Because we're going to make sure they get enough calls. So when the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act was put forward, we sent millions of calls into lawmakers across the country, and Senator Todd Young, a Republican in Indiana, said he was going to vote for it because he was receiving calls 10-1 in favor of the legislation, right? That's a seismic shift into politics.
And I think what people don't realize, especially when they feel so overwhelmed with mass shootings, climate change, banning of books, is the majority,
Right.
the numbers are on the side of gun control. It's just that the majority feels powerless.
Yeah.
And the minority, which has the money, dominates. And I think what's so important here is that if you organize and create this multicultural
Yes.
coalition, you see movement in the past 10 years. It's not just angry moms sitting there posting angrily. It's like angry moms saying, okay, let's use this anger and shift.
Yes.
Shift. So let's think next 5 years, right? So we saw this bipartisan push. And for many who are cynical, they're like, yeah, we still have mass shootings. It's not enough. This is something. It ain't enough.
Yeah.
What's the next step?
That's true. The Bipartisan Safer Communities Act was one very significant step forward on what is a much longer path. You know, you talk about mass shootings, and to be clear, mass shootings, school shootings, they're horrific, but they're about 1% of the gun violence in this country, right? It's the everyday gun violence that kills 110 Americans and wounds 200 more that we also must look at and fix. It is such a complicated issue, and it deserves holistic treatment. So we're not just looking at, for example, assault weapons bans, but we also need background checks. We need red flag laws. We need to disarm domestic abusers. We need to unlock dollars for community violence intervention programs, right? There's so much that needs to be done. And when that Manchin-Toomey bill failed in the spring of 2013 that we were just talking about, you know, I thought our work was done. I thought, okay, the country's not ready for this. We should pack up our bags and go home, right? Like, we'll do this another time, maybe. And what our very brilliant volunteers said was, wait a minute, we should be doing this work in city councils and school boards and state houses, because
locally,
maybe Congress is where this work ends and not where it begins. And so that is what we've been doing for the last decade, which is passing hundreds of good gun safety bills, stopping the NRA's agenda in state houses 90% of the time, sending home secure storage notification to over 8 million families at this point. And that is sort of the incremental, I understand that's a frustrating word to a lot of people, but it really is what leads to revolutions.
and I know it's a frustrating word, but I'm glad you connected the dots, because people need to hear that it doesn't happen overnight.
No.
It's 10 years of effort,
Yes.
incremental, step by step. Local
Yes.
becomes national, right? Local becomes state, becomes national. And that's how you get the movement, right? That's how you chip away. But some people then are frustrated because they don't see that story. They don't hear that story. What they see is, I'm in Texas right now. And just like in Florida and other states, Texas, with this leadership, says, you know what? We're going to do permitless carry. So you don't have to have a permit. We won't do background checks. You're 18 years old. Guess what? You can carry a gun. More guns. It's like that Oprah meme, but for guns. You get a gun, and you get a gun, and you get a gun. And it's some dark humor here, but I was in Texas last week. I was doing a book launch for my friend Mehdi Hassan, MSNBC host. We're talking about his book. It's in Texas. It's Houston. All the questions were the following, one after another. A teacher comes up and says, just 2 days ago, I had to protect 35 kids from an active shooter. After her, a middle-aged man said, how can I protect my family from gun violence? After him, another person says, in Texas, right now, I have no idea who has a gun. One after another, in Texas. So this was a community that does not side with the Republican leadership, who now has to live with the reality that they can't feel safe. And so you're giving people hope here, but then there are other Texans who are like, what can I do? I'm in the wild, wild west here.
So, first of all, 90% of Americans support common sense gun laws, like a background check on every gun sale. That includes men, that includes Republicans, that includes gun owners, right? So at some point there is a tipping point on this issue. In fact, anecdotally, I will tell you that we have 4 of our volunteers. We actually elected 140 volunteers to office this last legislative cycle or election cycle, and 4 of them are in Missouri. And they said when they were knocking doors that Republicans were allowing them to put their signs in their yards, even though they were Democrats, because they were afraid their kids weren't safe in their schools, right? So at some point there is a tipping point where lawmakers will be held accountable. What we're seeing is, because we live in such a polarized time, that blue states are passing good, strong, data-proven gun laws, and red states are weakening gun laws. And so you can kind of look at this patchwork of gun laws, right? We're only as safe as the closest state with the weakest gun laws. But you can see that states that are red, that have weakened their gun laws, have more gun violence and more gun death. I know it's intuitive. Blue states have less gun violence and less gun death. Right? So we know how to fix this problem. And to your point about what do people in states like Texas or Florida, where we're seeing,
Permitless carry.
Right. First of all, don't give up hope. I have seen states flip in the last decade that I never imagined would. Virginia, Michigan, Minnesota. We now have a trifecta in Maryland. We have a trifecta in Massachusetts. Like, I have seen serious change and then good gun laws passed. You will get there if you don't give up. But also, we just kind of goes back to what we're talking about, is this local work. Maybe you can't get your state legislature yet to do the right thing. You got to get involved in electoral cycles, but also, what are you doing through your city council? What are you doing through your school boards? What are you doing culturally to educate people, for example, about secure storage? So it is like drips on a rock, but if you stop doing the work, you won't have change.
I agree with you, but this is a pushback, not to you, but what I hear from folks and what I also experience, right? This is the tipping point. Sandy Hook, I thought would be the tipping point. You see, and I'm not being glib here, but you see a rather affluent suburban community. Kids, white kids, and America did nothing. Then you see Uvalde in Texas. That has to be the tipping point. The election came, and you saw just what happened in Texas, right? You see Florida, these kids, Parkland kids, who should be just relaxing, turning into activists because they're so angry. And that wasn't the tipping point. And so many of my generation, who are parents and so many younger, are like, this country will never give up guns. Or a segment of this country will never give up guns. Because if they can see dead babies in Sandy Hook, if they can see Uvalde in Texas and their response is permitless carry, I mean, are we just stuck in this cycle of violence?
I think we go back to this idea of nothing is going to change overnight. The system is not set up that way, and we are living in very polarized times. I would push back on this idea that nothing happened. Look what happened after Sandy Hook's school shooting. Moms Demand Action started. We're the largest gun violence prevention organization in the nation.
Thanks to your anger?
Thanks to anger. But, you can name a bunch of states where things have gotten worse, but I can tell you so many where they've gotten better. I can also tell you all the states where we've stopped permitless carry and stand your ground and arming teachers
Name me a couple.
and forcing guns onto college campus. States, like I mentioned to you, where we flipped the makeup of the legislatures, places like Virginia and Massachusetts and Maryland.
Virginia right now, right?
Yeah, but also Minnesota and Michigan. So there's so many places where good work is being done that wouldn't have been done. And then, you mentioned Uvalde. The Bipartisan Safer Communities Act happened after Buffalo and Uvalde. So change is happening. I just think that sometimes this feeling of hopelessness is an excuse for cynicism and not doing anything. And I think Moms Demand Action is a case study in not giving up, and change does happen.
It's also an aspect, I'm glad you mentioned the statistic, that overwhelming majority of gun owners also support some sort of reform and actually are safe. And when it's a lot of it's cultural, right? Because like you, we've traveled across America. You talk to people, they're like, listen, guns, like my granddaddy had a gun. He gave it to my daddy. He took me hunting. Yeah. So the people who say, got to get rid of the Second Amendment, got rid of guns, that's never going to happen because people love their guns. So this coalition, I think it's important for people to know, and push back against me, but this is just my take. You got to bring in the gun owners with you. You got to bring in the folks from Minnesota and Michigan and Virginia who grew up with their daddy's guns and have the stories. This is part of their culture. And what have you seen when it comes to storytelling and messages that wins them over on your side?
Yeah, I mean, many of our volunteers are gun owners or their partners are gun owners. There's 400 million guns in this country, right?
More guns than people.
That's right. But there are peer nations that have high rates of gun ownership and very low levels of gun violence. The reason we have a 25 times higher gun homicide rate than any peer nation.
Can you repeat that one more time?
Yes, we have a 25 times higher gun homicide rate than any peer nation. And that's because of easy access to guns and the fact that we have a gun lobby that's been given a seat at the table and has been allowed to write our gun laws, not to protect public safety, but to protect their profits, right? So gun owners are a very important part of this discussion. They don't feel you need, for example, an AR-15 to hunt deer, and they are responsible and they are reasonable and they do support regulating guns so that we're all safer. It's really what we're talking about is this very vocal minority of gun extremists who had their way in the Senate for a long time. They're losing power because we passed this legislation last summer, and in some state legislatures, and they're losing their seats too. So I get that a decade seems like a long time, but when it comes to activism, we have so much more to do. We just have to keep doing it.
A decade seems like a long time, and you've been the voice and the face of Moms Demand Action and for 11 years. And as we were discussing before, I was like, you volunteer. And to make it personal for a moment, it seems like a long time, and you're like, now I'm stepping down. The decision to step down, why now?
You know, I have always felt that a founder's role should be finite. And I have asked myself every year for the last 11 years if it's time to step down. And there have been times when the answer was no or maybe, and then something would happen, a piece of legislation that I needed to be a part of.
Endless crises.
Endless crises, as you can imagine. And then this year, after the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act passed, it felt like a bookend to me. You know, I think a founder's role is to sort of build the space for people to be a part of, but it's really the people who are in that space that bring the value. And I think it's important that I step back so that other people can step forward and bring new ideas and new energy. It's been the honor of a lifetime to do this work. I will still be involved. I'll be a Moms Demand Action volunteer in California.
Moms is a mom till the end.
Moms is a mom till the end, for sure.
I only got 30 seconds. I wish I had more time, but I do like this case for optimism. And for Gen Z, right, who's going through so much and who might feel hopeless, and we can't blame them. This is your camera. Can you make a case to be optimistic that we don't have to live in fear of mass shootings in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the lockdown generation is the key to solving this problem, right? I mean, it's an intergenerational issue, and if they vote and use their voices on this issue, they will affect change.
Shannon, thank you for your advocacy. Thank you for your anger, and thank you for using your anger for positive change.
Thank you.
And I hope you can finally take a nap.
I will do that.
For a day at least. Shannon will join the Responding to Moments Building Powerful Communities panel this afternoon at 2:30 at the Hilton, Austin downtown, and we'll be back live at 12:30 this afternoon with whistleblower and author Chelsea Manning. These interviews are also streaming live during the event on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/SXSW. I'm Wajat Ali, and thanks for watching.